Thank you, Ambassador, the Institut Francaise, the Alliance Francaise, for your generosity and commitment and support to this initiative and the initiatives that we will take forward next year. I would also like to particularly thank Estelle, the cultural director, who has really helped walk me through a lot of the processes involved in realizing a project for the state, as it were, which will happen next year. In fact, many states will be part of this initiative. So for Estelle and the team at the Institut Francaise, thank you very much. And of course, the Alliance and all the directors involved. This is certainly a collective, collaborative effort. As the ambassador mentioned, I do suggest that you take the time to see the exhibition downstairs of the 4 contemporary artists who are using the analog as a way of intervening with archives, often their personal repositories, with history, with intermedia practices, and hence also in dialogue with each other. This is the work of Uzma that has been shot on a late 19th century camera, a collaborative work with a photographer from Birla Mandir in New Delhi. And so the exhibition itself is more along the lines of a conversation piece. There is a departure from linearity, the documentary, as well as narrative, which punctuates their process-oriented approaches. How one reconstructs a life through images by seeing them repeatedly disclose, fragment after fragment, detail after detail, a projection of self as a reference to the world. The exposé of photo objects in the exhibition then courts a more interpretive rationale. It is incremental, it moves towards the analog, and suggests, perhaps metaphorically, that the blemish that is left behind by a glass can never determine its volume, and such is the nature of practice itself. And so to step back and see the works is also about positioning oneself, peeling away a layer of time, maybe adding another strip of time, as the image is always about bringing us back to the object of seeing and being seen, framing and being framed, how we appear to the world and what we choose to show. Our sensitivity and our sensitivity is also an image sensitivity. The occasions on which we might show them, or we might hide them, we might forget them, and perhaps even destroy them. And so the image practice, and this is the work of Edson, and he uses 19th century photomaking processes to develop work today. The photomaking practice then perhaps is also about individuality, singularity, the single frame that is fixed in time and is a mirror to others. But this notion was pitched historically too against the forces of mass industrial production and remain operative symptoms of a contemporary. What ties us to the larger realm of image production is not only about this global culture of circulation, but a compass that points to the liberating escapism of the imaginary, the otherworldly, the anomaly. How an image can and does rupture, manufacture, determine, and even falsify place. I show you now the optical collage of Sukanya. Time is static, impressed upon an image is unhinged when it is received over a stretch. The object accrues new meaning through recording, reception, transmission, and so durational lapses and interpretive thresholds are encountered, often breached, especially in our image-effused present, which has an animated and uncharted vocabulary. The grammar of an image's testimony then takes recourse to the domain of personal history, social lives. They are composers of new experiences, coalesced by revisiting and reliving an ever-changing present that is memory's raw data or scaffolding for the future. This seminar brings together specialists from India and France for the most part and the United States so as to examine shifts, how the convergence of platforms and site-specific projects inform our points of view, thinking about situations in which images are openly received and critically debated. The growing exposure of personal histories and social diversities have today led to the making of unique forms, and yet the gesture to location, geography, cultural specificity are aspects that the language of image making has less acutely imagined. Can we readily access locational values in the present, assume the realities of shared images when fiction and fantasy are as integral to their generation? The 4 discussion-oriented panels are then geared towards understanding not only the craft, but the reception of images in a world of expanding visual cultures and visual tropes. The sessions then, which have been collectively realized with the moderators with an eye to the expansive, almost dominating experience of photography in the present, suggest some discursive challenges that lie ahead in an environment which once again is suffused with images that are not only situated of a particular place, but symptomatic, determined by the medium itself. And in taking this position, I would like to suggest 2 aspects. The shifting place of an image in the present can help us re-evaluate the motives and the futures of media today. A stimulating composite of new forms, found material, constructed surfaces. And as the world has become closely observed, visualized, surveyed, documented, illustrated, regional sensitivity is perhaps at the core of this debate. But can we make propositions about the future, assert the importance of public spaces, source images from developing archives, and then project what really matters, what really changes the course of things, without investigating what is locally available, how it is received over here? Images produced in one place and at one time, in India for instance, as we have found through our investigation of a photography quarterly called PIX over the last 6 years. And these are some of the shows that we did, about 25 in different countries. They mirror similar events or moments even in Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Nepal, and even Myanmar, which is the source of our next quarterly. The pitch of how images have managed to escape their place of origin by physically moving across other continents, not only shared online, is the story that must come to light, especially at a time when the family heirloom is taking on a highly contentious, if not deeply political resonance. Images mark where we come from. And in this situation, what then is the Citizens Archive? Sarah Amy Fishlock's work that I showed here last year. What then is the role of a secular culture of production and dissemination? Does it exist within the contours of viewership and authorship? Through an exhibition done last year, I was looking at the works of 31 artists, one of whom was Robert Ormerod. I'm talking about the artist from the United Kingdom. We thought about the object or the idea of origins, a place of birth, a place of beginning, and how one determines the nature of a city through its people, and found that every initiative was incomplete given how the demography kept changing substantially with every passing year. Asylum seekers, always living in unfamiliar conditions, with their housing eventually being demolished given the resident population's resistance to a foreign community. Asian, African, Middle Eastern, East European. And so in order to arrest the fragmentation of histories from complete abstraction, if not erasure, the question then that motivated us were discussions around the rooted connections, biographies, and cultures, a system of mapping that is personal, deeply subjective, meticulously self-scrutinized. How can we draw on our foundations, on aspects of intimacy, even gender, as the harvest too would be about varying equations that one has with those who are closest to us, and often their projections of us. Individuals, communities, and spaces that are as much an anchor, but can they be a blockade? That is a question that is being asked. The second aspect is very much an eye to consumption, exhibition, and display. I particularly like these sketches of Herbert Bayer, the Austrian-American artist, of a diagram of a 360-degree view of a field of vision that he made in the 1930s. Bayer, whose pioneering work in Europe in the 1930s brought photography into play with almost every other media, thought carefully about the viewer, about the audience. And he has placed it here on a platform several inches above the ground, a position that augmented the viewer's ability to scan the ceiling, the floor, and the panels. His field of vision formula acknowledges the relationship between the audience and the object, and his design, that was influenced by Marcel Brauer, Walter Gropius, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, is not contained by the physical limits of the room. And exhibited works that he created was also part of an exhibition called the Building Workers' Union in Berlin, and also the Society of Applied Arts exhibition that was done at the Grand Palais in Paris in the 1930s, something like that. Bayer created an exhibit where images were composed of louvres that would turn automatically, thereby presenting alternating visuals. He often guided the visitor through the show by placing cutout footprints on the floor, which in representational terms functioned as a visible trace of spectators moving through the installation, a bit too hardcore, I think, for me. But as part of the French Embassy's photography festival next year, provocatively called Flash France, which will feature some iconic and not so known works from Europe and France from the 1930s as well, one of the historical standpoints that will also be taken was with a succeeding exhibition which was called The Family of Man, that historically represents shifts wherein images played a very functional role. And with our timeline bearing that in mind, we will also show not only the works within a museum space of the works from the 1930s, but also works by contemporary artists, 15 or 16 contemporary artists in public space, as mentioned earlier. But with reference to the family of man, the exhibition traveled to several countries, 8 countries, including India, and I found one image from the Jahangir Art Gallery in Bombay, taken in 1956, well after it was inaugurated in 1955. Displayed in a form that also references, in a way in which social media works today, this is from the 55 show, a maze or an atlas of images from around the world. The imagination of that exhibition brought all beings together by virtue of how photography itself had become an amorphous entity, an authorless entity, and with a shared sense of originality, authenticity. What the family of man sought, and I use this again because of the surfeit of images today, was to partition time into social categories: life, death, birth, joy. But its overall rendering was meant to be analytical rather than mimetic, a social representation rather than a national production, collective rather than individual, the last of which drew the most criticism in time. It also embodied notions of community and transnational citizenship before the working classes had turned into mass consumers. The voice of the local was somehow, however, overwritten by the culture of display in that space. But was that a legitimate threat to the medium itself? In a wall text that was written by Carl Sandburg, the brother-in-law of the curator, Edward Steichen, and recipient of the Pulitzer Prize of Poetry a few years earlier, the builders of huts, the skyscrapers, the jungle hunters, the landlords, the landless, the loved and the unloved, the lonely and the abandoned, the brutal and the compassionate, one big family hugging close to the ball of the earth for its life and for its being, a generation keeping the family of man alive and continuing. I take this example now, 70 years later, as the process of image construction has become perhaps the pursuit of the unlikely, the opposite, the unrealized, the unseen, that probes every life for something that it can be. It can be for pleasure, and it can be feared. It is not only the man in the street, but the absence that seems more and more represented today, something in between. And through the images we cherish and we share, and the more we search, the more we skim, the more we probe and realize and envision, the more we conjure or conjecture beyond the surface of things, beyond presence. And that is the essence of what we might try to capture in time. The debates within the panels today will certainly aid and inform how we will envision a display means by presenting questions about affiliation, perhaps, about where and why one is able to position images in a sea of images, a perpetual oscillation when negotiating one's life, socially, politically, maybe even visually. By interreferencing these discussions at a subsequent time, the idea would be to think about how freewheeling forms, prints, books, videos, have become drivers of a campaign to align the eye with a very mutable world, but also a sieve of practices that likens self-expression with societal transformation. And this is where the configuration of photography today, the language, its propositions, are the most uncertain, if not uncharted. How do bracketed images filtered through nations and geographies, 2, 3 or more, or many, express each other's impressions and limitations, or mobilize each other's tendencies without openly mirroring their own ethics? And here I find the words of Jean-Paul Martineau to be of significance on the curatorial. From being reactive to the world, precipitating another reflection on the world, invariably sparking ways to change the world, works of art reflect the myriad ways of being implicated in this world, not just as passive recipients, but as active members of a world that is never one with itself, that is always out of joint, out of place, always intrinsically ours, of our own making. The archive as a source of preserving time, which will be debated through the panel moderated by Kaushik Bhaumik, may well damn every conception of a singular truth, even if realized collectively. The archive postulates beyond the claim of any one voice. It does suggest how everything has a hint of patriarchy, hierarchy, maybe even illegitimacy because the world is classist and a privileged few have access to a lot. But it is also the power and the potential the archive has of reconstruction. What remains allows for ideas to morph from one state to another state. Can the archive suggest propositions of what is being made and collected in the present? Propositions for shifting the record-keeping or singular frame to a reel of references that is continual. Propositions for curricula to become somehow more decentered with readings of personal testimony. Propositions for debate on the narrativization of history that is still being determined, is not complete. Can images be stable enough, wait long enough, face each other constantly to realize that in every act of reading also lies perhaps an act of transgressing? Is the suggestion then that what the surface is only a glimpse of what has taken place, and it will never accurately fulfill reality or the gap that reality creates in the readings of those, but maybe the reading itself is the quest? The second session on the public and the private may not only suggest ways of voicing appreciation, but also investigating a public space as a critical one and a private space as an immensely receptive one. But with regard to media, the world where Instagram, Facebook have taken on sort of large corporate enterprises unto themselves, I then wonder about the expectation of privacy in a public space, a space that is already so over-public. Is that a space for actually creating debate, or is it a space for creating statements? The operative question may here lie in an understanding and perhaps misreading of an audience that is always changing. But should the legitimate question be about thinking of the challenging role of viewership in an age of expanding visual literacy? The third session on the archive post-lunch can be thought of as an organism without beginning, middle, or end. Is a collection going to become systemic to every field? And if it does become systemic, locatable, manageable, databaseable, how do we actually account for randomness, experimentation, and breakages of time, and hence our archives sanctified spaces of truth, or just constructs? And so the last session is about what has changed the course of visualization, of viewing with the passage of time. How are memories then re-embedded, enhanced, changed, altered, and invoked through events that may have stood out for the practitioners who will be talking about it. The larger question could be perhaps about what is the role of context today. Is there reliability and accuracy in context? Can what has occurred continually matter today? And if it does, what conditions its passage into that? So the limits of any practice must be pitched alongside the possibilities that it creates for that practice. If we ask whether institutional forays, even this moment, into the field are personal or motivated thereon, we should perhaps consider that there is something inevitable in this process. In a world where curators or academics, practitioners, writers fear their spheres of reading are very, very different, not necessarily aligned, when the stream of exhibitions, texts, and locations unleash their systems of bracketing, embodying, editing, representing, the provision then is to think about the ironies and the potential danger of what globalization could have done, is doing, with replacing it with the term universal. The universal language of photography. Is there indeed such a thing as the universal language of photography? Some of the ideas that have filtered into this reading today, my own reading, are from an exhibition also from the 1960s called Live in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form, by Harold Zeman. This is a view of it. A Swiss exhibitor and artist who took on over the Kunsthalle in Bern and became one of the first freelance curators to date. Though not engaged directly with photography, he was always deeply concerned with form, with images, how they could recreate a relationship to the viewer. So I would like to end with showing you this particular video. James Norton's Suspended Landscapes from 2014 that I showed again last year as part of a broader exhibition roused many concerns. A video based on photography's subject that is totally dislocated. It explores what James calls interconnected landscapes, how the edges and peripheries of images evoke an understanding and a use of refrain perhaps, a refrain from easy definition, echoing a transitional and subtle vision of the future. Here photography, film and sound and painting allow for an accidental discovery and feed into the process of creation. Media then is significant for everything that belies this seminar. The transcribing and transmitting of various media bring to the fore an anthropological sensitivity about images, about evidence, about correlating experience. Cultural differences that have been perceived through photography, lines of inquiry around location, identity, are all of these individual or collective? And so is there, in the location of photography today, the sense of global provincialism, appropriation to suit location, where the regional, ethnic, and gender identity of a body that is made is reduced to a scar tissue? A monolithic sense of understanding an image will always decry its interpretive potential. And perhaps then the function of photography is determined always by its location in the present, but perhaps multiple moments of one time, as well as its location on the ground, rather than just in the virtual. Thank you very much.